what are the key ideas that you identify that you see carried through? Talk about what those are. There's and I'm thinking of the sections where you're talking about the separation or the the distinction of nature, supernature, the idea of politics as an activity of human reason, and then charity as the gift of God's love. And then, because when you take those ideas, and then I suppose what I see in the book, you're describing this very traditional upbringing with these core Catholic ideas, and that's in his pre Peace Corps years, and the speeches that he gives before that. And then when he enters public life, joins the Kennedy administration, and is speaking as a public official, speaking as someone in the government, his language completely shifts. And there's this, and you're making the claim that although the language shifted, those ideas are still operative and present.
Right.
And I suppose, and I guess, for some readers, it may be difficult to see, well, I know what it means to talk about charity, to talk about grace. But then when you say that compassion, enthusiasm are adequate names for that thing, how does that work?
The only way it works is if you're able to differentiate the word itself, the words themselves, from their relationship to the flow of consciousness that connects to them or that they carry. So if grace is an already out there now thing, if we can use that language, then grace and compassion must be different, because they're two words, must name different conscious entities. But if you're attentive to the fact that you have a mind, you're using it, and you're very aware, because as Sarge was, that he said the rosary every day, he went to mass every day, he cultivated his inner life in that sense, and was able to recognize that if you're engaged in compassion for others, if you're set up in such a way that enables you to pay attention to other people in their own terms, to care for them and for what they need in their own terms rather than yours, or rather than ones that benefit your group, then you're really working in the world in a graceful manner, in that technical sense. And so he focused on the performance that connected to the interiority, and came up with a language that wasn't particular to any one particular tradition, but could be linked to all of them. In Lonergan's terms, he was a foundational thinker in terms of the functional specialties. He wasn't operating. He could easily shifted from the doctrinal language of his Catholic upbringing that he was using in the 50s when he was in the public life and working in civil rights in Chicago, and went to TC. There'd been a couple of Supreme Court decisions, and he had to think about the relationship of religion, church and politics, religion and state, and yet was certainly not felt that the relationship between the two was absolutely crucial. He said our efforts at social change, our efforts at peacemaking would be doomed. That was his language, if we didn't somehow draw on those spiritual resources. And the way to talk about that in a way that could bring everybody in, whether they were believers or not, whether they were Christians or not, whether they were Catholics or not, was to begin talking about compassion and service. And he saw those as spiritual values and spiritual drivers, really. And he didn't talk about the shift. He just made that shift. And one of the things that was interesting for us was and Ken did a lot of the work on this, was to correlate the before and after speeches. We both worked on it together, but it was, I remember meeting with Ken in Canada and in his home, and we spent, weekends just going back and forth and figuring out, getting our own aha moments about what Sarge was really doing. It's great fun. Did I get that, Ken?
Yes, you did. The thing that was, first of all, I have lovely memories of those meetings. The thing for me that was compelling was that for Sarge, he used the word charity in the original, I should say in the speeches in the 1950s. And that for those of us who normally think about the common usage of words, charity refers to something that I do. So I have to go out and be charitable person by giving a gift to somebody else. But Sarge was theologically educated, and he knew that charity is a theological virtue, which is to say, charity is not something that first and foremost is not something that I do, but it's something that God does to me. And that when I receive the gift of charity, I am changed from one state to another state. In the prior state, I was unable to do X. In the after state, I am able to do X because of healing and because of elevating. And that the language of healing and elevating was the language that Sarge would have been taught his theology through, for example, the work of Jacques Maritain. But Sarge had to get inside that and recognize that the experience of being transformed by the Spirit is something that happens actually in a lot of people's lives in a lot of different ways that may not be recognized in religious terms, but that still happens. And that he was able to recognize that and to use the language, for example, of compassion and service. When you give yourself with compassion to the service to another person, things change in people's consciousness, and you actually become a cooperator with this transformative work that the Spirit is doing. And that he had this enormously well cultivated discernment for this operation of the Spirit in transforming situations from before to after, in which after things become possible that wouldn't have been possible before. And it was that was really, really something for me. And that he was able to first talk about it with this older language and then shift over. And we could actually make these correlations by identifying ways in which when he speaks to one audience in the 1960s, he uses this word, but he speaks to another audience in the 1960s and he used that word. And he's talking about the same thing. And oh, by the way, you can see the same thing happening back in his speeches in the 50s. So,
and what we recognized was that he was somehow able to differentiate three experiential streams: one, the data of sense and the data of consciousness, and Lonergan's way of talking about them, but then also spiritual experiencing as well. And he was able to, he identified them in himself, he could identify them in others, he could differentiate the two. And then he was politically savvy enough that he knew how to build programs, how to construct programs like the Peace Corps, and that's what we argue, which enabled him to spiritualize politics without politicizing religion, to open people in terms of their roles, their engagement with other people in ways that were intrinsically compassionate and service oriented, and to open them up to the flow of the Spirit that was going on, that he knew was going on in them anyway, and to kind of increase the probabilities of that being actualized.
Why does politics need to be spiritualized? What does that mean?
Well, if I'll go first, and then again can wrap it up and fill it out. For Sarge, for me too, I guess you could say, I think for both Ken and for me, politics needs to be spiritualized because it needs to create an order of greater good for all the people living within a political sphere. And it means that it should be, and that if you're going to have a polity that has equal opportunity, if you're going to have a polity that has that's compassionate to all people, you need to have the Spirit involved, because human beings cannot intrinsically do that ourselves. We're intrinsically self-referenced, we're intrinsically group referenced, and narrow-minded in terms of the structures and frameworks that we think with and when we build when we build our policies. So you have to open it up in ways that will allow the spirit to correct it. And I mean, and it needs to be methodological in the sense you need to spiritualize politics so that newness can be discovered, that what needs to be healed can be addressed.
Anything else? Anything to add,
No,
Ken?
I just felt that I was getting rapturous, and that led me to be less precise than I should have been. So Ken can ground that.
I guess what I if I can add one little bit to that, it's the way democracy was understood by Sarge. There's a way in which we think about democracy habitually that somehow democracy gives us, as citizens, it gives us freedom. It gives us freedom to be whatever we want, and all these heavy burdens of control are lifted, and so I can do what I want. And that what Sarge knew is that once people start doing what they want, the amazing thing about democracy is that it gives us, each one of us, particularly to the extent that we're allowed to continue this kind of automatic self-referencing way that's in a common sense way, kind of me being ordinary me, is that we wreck things for somebody else. And we wreck things for the way all of us live together, and we don't notice that. We think it's wonderful. Typically, the real implications of what we do don't get felt until quite a bit later, when we don't correlate it with what we were doing at the time. And that the fact is that democracy actually places more burdens on citizens than any other form of society, precisely because it gives each citizen far more liberty to do things that are either creative and constructive on the one hand, or dysfunctional and destructive on the other hand, and that we have enormous power to ruin things for everybody in a democracy, far more than what we would have had. And so consequently, the resources for helping us be our better selves rather than our crappy selves become very important. What are we going to draw upon to do this more difficult work, when in fact, in much of our lives, we don't really have to, because we can default to our crappy selves, and yet we're called to be our better selves. And that what Sarge knew is that all of the various philosophical and religious traditions, that's what they do. They provide resources to help us move from our lower selves to our higher selves. And that politics, especially in a democracy, needs the resources of religions to help all of us more regularly aspire and to live out the aspirations of being our better selves rather than our crappy selves.
I just want to reflect back something that you're not saying, and something that I think sounds important. So when people think about politics, they often just think about government. And you're not talking about spiritualizing government. You're talking about the citizen as the political actor. And as political actors, we citizens need the help of the spirit, because, as you said, we wreck things for ourselves and for each other. Everything we touch turns to something other than gold. And so we need that sort of healing, that elevating power of the spirit.
Except for the fact that many government programs actually structure and carry the way we respond to each other and the way we treat each other. And so those policies and programs need to be spiritualized as well, by which we mean open to the possibility of transformation rather than locking down
Okay.
and increasing the probability of treating each other like crap. As Ken would
And
say.
that's, I guess that's what you were talking about earlier when in the context of the separation idea, is that we're dealing with how institutions relate to each other.
Right,
Is that what you're okay?
that's right.
And how institutions channel the actions of individuals in certain directions by virtue of the institutional structure. And in some cases, in directions that individual citizens might not even choose themselves to go, if either for both for the better and for the worse.
So for instance, in when Sarge was designing the Peace Corps, he said, what are the basic ideas or rules that would go into the creation of it? One, learn the language of the people you're going to deal with. Two, anchor yourself in their customs and culture. Three, engage with them at the level of economic opportunity and lifestyle that they have. Four, realize that the development of peoples and nations is worth your life. And five, prepare to suffer.
Wow.
So if you're willing, and he structured the roles, he structured the tasks, he structured the goods of order in Lonergan's terms of Peace Corps in accordance with those things. And anybody who said, I want to help create peace in the world, I want to help bring development to countries that need our help, and I don't exactly know how to do it, but I feel called to do that. He provided a structure for them to discover, Peace Corps volunteers I'm talking about, to have Peace Corps volunteers discover how they could be of service, broadly speaking, making friends and building peace, as Sarge put it. He also
So there is a spiritualizing of government too, in that sense of structuring the institutions as in the way that Sarge structured the Peace Corps along these rules, and the rules kind of operationalize our contribution, our cooperation with the spirit in this personally transformative way.
Yeah, and a normative cooperation in the sense that you didn't have to be Catholic or Jewish, or you could be agnostic, or it didn't matter what race or gender you were, but there were certain ways that you needed to be. You needed to engage people in the host country. And the other thing that Sarge was always clear about was that this needed to be voluntary. These needed to be free decisions. The country receiving Peace Corps volunteers needed to ask. So they weren't imposed by the United States. It was like, yes, we would like to engage with Peace Corps volunteers to help. And then they would also be able to identify what Peace Corps volunteers would serve. For instance, if they were concerned about AIDS, or if they were concerned about malaria, or they were concerned about blindness, or they're concerned about nutrition, or they were concerned, then they would say, we need help in these areas, or we're concerned about small business startups, then Peace Corps would respond to what those particular needs were. And the Peace Corps volunteers themselves would be engaged not to tell people what they should do, but to go in and say, what do you need, and on what terms, and how can I understand what you're struggling with, and let me help. And that kind of openness, that kind of curiosity, that kind of willingness to take all the projections that, as you can well imagine, that most country nationals would put on you, like, what are you doing here? I know about the United States. I know it's just a great hegemon in the world. I know you must be trying to sell something. I know you think you're better than I am. And there you are as a Peace Corps volunteer saying, nope, just here to serve, but you have to take all of that on and figure out who you are. And existentially, it's a hell of a spiritual task. And Sarge knew that. And he set up the trainings that people could stand strong. And he also said, anybody who needed to go, who needed to leave, all I had to do was leave, no questions asked, because it needed to be a voluntary service.
Completely voluntary.
Yep. And then he would say in his speeches, and it was confounding at first, he would say, I've gone to 40 countries, and I've met people of all different gender and race and creed, and they're all engaged in spiritual deeds. And these spiritual deeds are breaking down barriers of conflict, they're breaking down barriers of creed, they're breaking down barriers of nationality everywhere in the world. And he would just say that stuff in his speeches. And so Ken and I got to wrestle with, what? How do you do that? What are you talking about? And the testimonials of Peace Corps volunteers back it up.
I'm very intrigued by this idea that Sarge was able to I mean, did he stumble upon this? Did he know this ahead of time, that focusing on service is and focusing on service in this normative way, that this would be the thing that would bring about peace?
He knew it. I mean, it's hard to believe, but he knew it. I mean, if you think about the conditions under which he created the Peace Corps, January 21st, 1961, he was called by President Kennedy, and the president said, I need you to run this Peace Corps thing. And Sarge said, no, I don't know anything about a Peace Corps. And besides, you have a lot of political friends that you owe jobs to, don't pick me. And his response was, it's easier to fire a relative when this thing goes belly up than it is to a political friend. So I want you. And so Sarge said, okay. But I want a plan delivered by March 1st. So Sarge had 30 days to come up with a plan. Now, you know as well as I do that you can't derive a method in 30 days. But if you have a method, you could conceivably put together a program.
Mm.
And he did, and it was a method he'd worked out in, I mean, he had to figure out how to apply it in this situation. He had a lot of learning to do. It wasn't a technique, it wasn't a cookie cutter, but he knew what it took to build peace, and he knew what it took for people to be open to the spirit, and he knew what that was like for himself. And so he was looking for models that would make sense in terms of economic and personal development across cultures. And he had some experience opening things up in Chicago and desegregating schools and working in the education field. So he had plenty of experience and plenty of ideas. But it was an amazing feat. And I wish we had more Sarges in the world.
So, and one of the things he knew, it sounds like, is this priority of personal relations. That if you develop, if you focus on service and you focus on developing relationship, then you are setting the conditions for transformative experience. You're cooperating with the spirit in that way.
Well put.
In your collaboration is very interesting, because at the beginning you talked about coming from, Ken, you came from this conflict mediation area, and what you learned with Cheryl as far as how conflict is navigated and managed, and how to move from defensiveness, that the sort of defend attack mode in which people get into arguments, into a more curious, compassionate learning mode, that shift is extremely important in conflict. And when you talk about the Peace Corps, you sort of talk about that now on a bigger scale. It's kind of that dyadic experience writ large on a national stage. Can you say anything about that? Like,
sure,
how the Peace Corps functions to resolve conflict?
Yes. I'll just say something very, very quickly, and that is that one of the things that we discovered when we were working, Cheryl and I, on interpersonal conflict, was that when I'm engaged with you, Paul, when I'm working with you on a project together, and I'm finding that everything that you do kind of annoys me, and it kind of undermines what I'm doing, and I'm just finding that it's really, really hard to work with you. What emerges is what we would typically call a conflict. And what's interesting is a conflict is something in which you do something that evokes a response from me, and I do something back to you that evokes a response from you, and you respond to what I've done, and then in each turn of the wheel, instead of our collaboration moving towards progress and building things together, it actually works in the direction of fracture. And we just can't do anything. We can't collaborate. We can't achieve results. We just fight. And that one of the things that we discovered about conflict was that the traditional way in which conflict was understood, which is to say incompatible or conflicting goals, interests, desires, didn't explain that. It didn't actually explain well enough why conflict unfolds the way it does. And what we discovered is that what happens when you are responding to me in a way that pushes my buttons is that my feeling, and this is where my training as a conflict mediator and the process in the training in which you actually have to engage in an awful lot of role playing, in which you really feel from the inside what a conflict feels like. It really, really came in handy. What I realized is that what's going on is what's being evoked in me is a feeling that you're a threat to me. And that there's a threat to something that really, really matters to me. And I may not even have adequately articulated what really matters to me. All I do is feel the feeling of being threatened. And that what I realized, or what we realized together, the team, is that what happens when I feel threatened is that my ability to use my mind according to its kind of proper functioning stops. It blocks. It actually constricts the range of the operations of my mind and completely focuses my mind on protecting against you as the perceived threat to me, to something. And so it's as if I'm being kind of given this wide range of tools and this marvelous resource, my mind, to collaborate with you, to think about, to understand, to experience Paul's ideas, to collaborate with them, to help evaluate together, to make decisions so that we would together build things. And all of a sudden, this resource gets blocked. And so consequently, it provided us a way of thinking about why international conflicts, why interpersonal conflicts, why intergroup conflicts actually function so destructively as they do, because everything that the other party does evokes not what they intend, but it evokes some feeling of threat that actually contributes to the downward cycle. And that what I was able to notice, or what Jamie and I were able to notice when we were working with the text of Sarge, and in Jamie's case, working with a more personal familiarity of Sarge and actually the work of Peace Corps volunteers, is the way in which the engagement in this unquestioning kind of service that is part of the very structure of the Peace Corps gets at this feeling of threat and opens up host country nationals to a curiosity about Peace Corps volunteers and why are they here and where they're coming, that they wouldn't have otherwise had because they were locked into this feeling of threat. And so there's something about the program that gives rise to a way of interacting. And there's something about the way of interacting that actually gets to the core of these habitual feelings of threat that arise in interpersonal, that I found to be a wonderful illustration of the sorts of things that we had discovered together, Cheryl and I, in studying interpersonal conflict, in the transformative conflict, in writing the transformation conflict book. And so it provided kind of a resource for explaining this.
Mm-hmm. So the idea of service, and particularly the way, Jamie, you described service as not coming in and fixing things for people that I think's wrong with them, but coming in and working with people on problems that they define and working towards solutions that they have decided or that they've chosen for their own communities. And if I enter into that process, I'm reducing, I'm collaborating, as you said, so I am not provoking threat. I'm reducing, helping to reduce a person's experience of me as threatening. Or how would you describe that dynamic?
I think you're on to exactly how it would go. One thing I just, as a brief preface to get to your question, Ken and Cheryl were very generous with their work. They invited me into it, and so Cheryl trained me as an insight mediator as well. Of course, my questions were focused on the one you were just asking, because Peace Corps volunteers aren't mediators. I mean, it's a different institution. They aren't dealing with conflicts that two parties come and say, "Would you help us fix this? We can't do this." They're kind of working on, as you pointed out earlier, they're working on a broader scale and a different institutional frame to say, how can we advance the work of this nation? How can we advance the livelihood and the well-being of these people in whatever ways? And then you go there in that role and you're clear about that role. You're clear you don't have the answers. You just need to make yourself available and trust that there's this larger thing going on, which is the hard part, which is the spiritual part. There's this larger story going on beyond the one that you can imagine yourself telling. And you discover, you make friends, you discover, they get insights, you discover you're able to be useful in ways that you couldn't have imagined in your pre-service training, or you couldn't have imagined when you applied. So it's precisely putting people in that kind of role. And for a while, this was a very serious foreign policy idea in the Kennedy and Johnson administrations. When there was, in 1965, when there was a revolt or a revolution in the Dominican Republic, and we refer to this in the book at one point. Not the Dominican Republic. Yeah, the Dominican Republic. Sorry. The issue was how are you going to bring peace? And LBJ's idea was to send in 25,000 Marines, which he did. Sarge had argued for a while that he ought to send in 2,000 Peace Corps volunteers, and that was seriously. There were already 100 there, but they were the only Americans welcome, according to the rebel forces at the time, and it didn't work out that way. But it's too bad from my perspective that it didn't get to be a larger experiment in how do you build peace with the nations other than providing drones and guns and Marines and military training.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a pivotal moment there where there was a chance to have that happen as an ongoing part of American foreign policy, but it slipped away.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of joy and there's a lot of strength in what Sarge's story tells us about what the possibilities are, but there are also a lot of missed opportunities and a lot of, I would say, tragedy.
We can learn from those too, unfortunately.
That's right.
Earlier, when I was asking the question about why politics needs to be spiritualized, something in what Ken was saying got me thinking about politics on a global scale and the problem of nationalisms and the problem that nations with respect to each other in that philosophical language are in a state of nature with respect to each other. They don't recognize a common authority. And so there's no overarching rules, although we have courts and we have the United Nations. But what you just said about understanding, believing, and feeling myself in a bigger narrative and part of a bigger story that I can't tell suggests that through Peace Corps, people can begin to think about their mutual nations as part of a bigger story. Mm-hmm. And that then may provide that almost sense of the universal brotherhood, sisterhood of humankind, the sense that we are part of something together rather than just individual nations, each at war with each other. Does that sound?
Yeah, I
But-
think that's very good. I think there's a number of ingredients in what you've just said that really touch on things that I discovered in Sargent. First of all, that there's something intensely personal in kind of global international affairs, insofar as global international affairs move forward rather than fall back into decline. They do so as a result of something very, very personal. But the form of the personal contribution is often a mystery, and we just don't know how it is that it's going to happen. And Sarge knew that you can trust mystery because you can trust when you're equipped with the kind of the tools to focus on the right way of relating to others. You can trust the Holy Spirit to participate in this unblocking of our minds, because our minds actually are oriented towards each other, towards cooperation, towards interest, towards curiosity, and it's the blockages that actually give rise to these hostilities that magnify to the international level, and that you can trust in the Holy Spirit in some mysterious way to be flowing through my involvement as a Peace Corps volunteer in this situation to actually have some purchase at the international level. And that's a big thing to trust in, but it's also it's a story with a happy ending rather than a sad ending. That's pretty exciting. It generates a lot of energy.
And one of the exciting things about having you raise those questions or come to those insights in the process of this conversation, Paul, is that it's a reversal of the longer cycle of decline, isn't it? I mean, it's getting the larger framework of insights that would enable us to deal with the shorter cycle of Hobbesian war of all against all. That's a myth of the way things are rather than true to our experience.
Right. Well, that seems like a great place to end our interview, to end our conversation. It's very hopeful. Trust is not an easy thing. Trust in mystery is a difficult challenge, but it's wonderful to think that we can do that. Do you have any final thoughts or reflections on what working together, what writing this book, what learning about Shriver and conflict mediation meant to you and how it's changed you?
I found a friend.
You found friends.
Yeah, I found a friend in Jamie, and I found a friend in Sarge, and that I mean, it's interesting to say. I found a friend. You know, what do you find when you unpack that expression? A fellow traveler along a road that's worth traveling, with really lovely and important things to bring to that journey that help us all. That's a great thing to find in life, and I feel extraordinarily privileged to count Jamie as a friend, and I feel extraordinarily privileged to have found through Jamie a friend in Sarge that helps us all along this road.
Oh, that's very kind of you, Ken. Thank you. The friendship development was mutual, totally mutual. This book wouldn't have been written without Ken's support, and I couldn't have done it on my own. How did it change me? What did it do for me? Well, I think when I left graduate school, which was at the Divinity School at the University of Chicago, I was trained as a theologian there. And I went to take a job in the philosophy department at Georgia State University in Atlanta. And I had this sense that I wanted to figure out how contemplation, action, and social transformation would work. And there's a way in which the quest to answer the functional relationship of those things had marked my career choices. And meeting Sarge, developing a friendship with his son, Tim Shriver, and then working out these ideas in connection to Lonergan with Ken enabled me to pursue that. So there's a way in which it's been very personally fulfilling to what I take to be my call, however humble, in this world, and what I'm supposed to be doing with my mind, with my heart. And the book is just a small little thing, but it's but it's the result of a long process and and nothing we could have predicted in advance. So it's part of that mystery. It's part of that walking the walk in the cloud of unknowing, and being as good as you can and as open as you can. So it's been that sort of process for us, and we just
Wow.
hope it's accessible to others, and we hope it may be of use in ways that we can't imagine.
And we
Fantastic.
appreciate you helping us make it available to others, Paul.
Certainly,
appreciate it.
Paul. Thank you for your curiosity and for your, I mean, really the very smart and attentive line of questioning you've opened up for us. It was,
Well, thank you for the conversation today. I don't know, perhaps we'll do it again.
sounds good.
Okay,
It's fun.
it was. Thank you very much.